Batman The Long Halloween Part 2 is now out. This is 2 months, I think, after the first part came out, which I did review on my channel, and I said it was a pretty solid start and they were adapting it pretty well based on what I'd seen before, and so I was very excited to see what they would do in Part 2. Having read the graphic novel, I had some expectations for sure, and so far those were being met. So I was very excited to see how they would finally conclude the story, and this one takes place right after the end of the first part, which I'm going to talk about. So there are going to be spoilers for part 1 if you've not seen part 1 or you've not read the graphic novel. I'll talk a little bit about that. At the end of the first part, you had Poison Ivy basically entrancing Bruce Wayne and having him sign everything over to Carmine Falcone. And that's where part 2 begins. And you're getting closer to finding out who the Holiday Killer is, and eventually you do get that identity. And it's also about how basically every single thing just doesn't seem to be adding up. There seems to be a lot more going on under the surface, and now more villains are popping up, and Batman and Jim Gordon and Harvey Dent have to stop them. A big contrast of this one to the first part is that the first one was rated PG-13, this one is rated R. And so immediately when that announcement was made, I was very curious as to see what they'd done with this version that warranted that rating. Even though I do know there's a lot in the graphic novel itself that could warrant that rating, but I was still incredibly fascinated by the decision on the MPAA's part. And part 2 definitely ups the ante on a few things. It's more violent, it's much gorier, there is more abusive language, there's an F-bomb, which was kind of interesting. There is definitely a transformation that is present in this particular storytelling, and it does twist the narrative a little bit more. One of the issues that I feel like was sort of hinted at the end of the first part was that there were some liberties that were being taken in terms of the storytelling. If you thought that was an issue with part 1, part 2 is going to make you even more aware of it, because there are a lot more liberties taken in this one. There are some changes definitely that are made over here, which I do not remember at least reading about in the comics, so that was interesting. But there's definitely a very solid narrative that is created as a result of it. And overall, looking at these two parts, it forms a very great, very cohesive whole. This is now one of my favorite adapted Batman stories on the screen. They've done a really great job here. The voice acting remains phenomenal as usual, but this one is really Josh Duhamel as Harvey Dent's show. This is really his time to shine, and he does a remarkable job of it. But you do get a lot of great banter with other characters as well. Some really great character moments with Bruce Wayne, Batman, Selina Kyle. And since you're targeting the crime families in this story, and since you're learning a lot more about how the mob runs in Gotham, you get a lot of time with the mob families. You had that in part 1, you have that in part 2. You explore a lot of the dynamics, the tragedies that they're going through, and even though they're criminals who have done awful things in their lives, there is a definite feeling of hopelessness to all of this, because all of their members are dying one by one, and sort of getting a taste of their own medicine is definitely wreaking havoc in terms of how they're experiencing things and about how they're perceiving things. Again, this is not a case where they're asking you to sympathize with the villain, of course not. They're just asking you to look at it and like, okay, here I understand the fact that there is conflict here, that there is grief here. And I think that's what the film does in a very good way. Both of them do. And so did the graphic novel, in that exploring that aspect of it. This one is slower paced than the first one, though. The first one, I think I remember talking about this, but I thought it could have been paced a little bit better at points. This one definitely could have used a very similar jolt at a couple of moments. I feel like there were certain parts of it that were slower than other parts, and sometimes it did meander a little bit. Essentially, my problems with part 2 of The Long Halloween are the same as I had with part 1. I mentioned that sometimes the animation was a little inconsistent at times. That happens here too. That happens a little more in terms of like frame rates and how things move in a scene. Like sometimes one object will fall in one way and then something will fall in another way in the different frame rate, which was a little weird. So there's definitely that little thing that has definitely, made it past the two parts of the movie. That being said, it's not something that is, like I said, breaking the movie in any way. It's, like I said, an issue that I had with the first part too. And in a lot of ways, I felt about part 2 the same way I felt about part 1. It's a very solidly made adaptation, and eventually it brings the entire thing together in a very good fashion. And it gives enough focus to its villains and to its characters that make them riveting as well. there's a lot of character moments in this, as you know from the graphic novel as well, and so you don't want to lose that heart in the process of telling the story, the tragedy of it. And eventually, once you're approaching the finale and when you're approaching the big, reveals on who is who and what happens to, all these characters, the film never forgets that, and it never forgets the flawed humanity of some of them, as well as the more um, dangerous tendencies of others, if you will. So yeah, I would recommend both parts of it. Now looking at them as a cohesive whole in terms of an adaptation as full, I think they've done a really, really great job. This adds up to what, about 2 hours and 50 minutes of movie total, which is like crazy. Like that's a massive adaptation. I wouldn't be surprised if they release it on like one edition, like they did Dark Knight Returns at one point in time. I'll be interested to see if they actually do that, because this is a really well told saga, and it's one of the better adaptations of a graphic novel that I've seen in years. I'm very, very happy with what they've done here, and I'm hoping that, as time goes on, like I said, those little inconsistencies here and there, I'm sure they'll be mapped out and they'll be smoothed out over time. But I was very happy with The Long Halloween Part 2 and The Long Halloween in general. And I'm going to give Part 2 an 8 out of 10. The exact same rating as I gave part one, so all of it rounds off to like an 8 out of 10 in total. That's my rating for the entirety of these two parts. Guys, thank you very much for watching. Leave your thoughts in the comments below if you've seen The Long Halloween Part 2, and what are your thoughts on both the parts combined together as a, in summation. As always, if you like this, guys, please do subscribe, and I'll see you guys at the movies.